So welcome back to this next session. In this next session, we're continuing to look at critical thinking for effective learning. And in the previous session, we mentioned quantitative and qualitative approaches to thinking, where you gather information with numbers, measuring what's happening, and then qualitative, you ask questions that explore more deeply further down. We looked at the value of asking the right questions. How do you choose the questions? Being open to different questions. We looked at the value of looking at things that are new for us, but the challenge in that you need some expertise to teach us about the basics when you start a new subject area. We looked at the value of writing down the questions, writing down our thoughts. Sometimes we only know what we're thinking after we write it down, and the value of plain language. But we also, one thought was on neurodiverse. Marcia, you mentioned this. Marcia, what do we mean by neurodiverse approaches to thinking, diversity of ways of thinking? What's meant by the term neurodiverse?
Well, I currently work as a school chaplain at the moment, and a lot of the children, which is just basically sort of an emotional, spiritual support kind of role, but a lot of the kids that I work with are neurodiverse. Which is, what is a neurotypical person? They think in a neurotypical way, but it's quite funny, actually. The more I learn about neurodiversity, the more I think I don't know anyone who is actually neurotypical. So, I mean, these can be the types of kids who have, say, ADHD or other learning difficulties, autism, all these sorts of things. And essentially, they don't think the same way as what a neurotypical student would think. They might hyperfixate on things or be really interested in a particular area and not interested at all in something else. So if we have an openness to sort of be like, oh, well, how can I deliver things in such a way that will grab their attention, and not only grab their attention, but hold their attention, and then get them to actually thinking about the topic or whatever it is that you might be trying to teach them, and open up their own curiosity about it. So yeah, and we need to have the ability, I think, to understand that not everybody thinks the way we do, and that's okay.
Yeah, so good. And when it comes to the different subjects, we'll discover that some people love sport, and then other people love art, and some love English and drama, and so different students are going to like different areas, but we have the challenge that as teachers, we are seeking to introduce all the students to all these areas. So it's important that we are aware of these differences. What are some of the methods that we use in critical thinking and thinking? One is observation. So one of the first steps that we might ask the students is to look at the world around and to think about what is there in the world around. We have to recognize that the unique human capacity that we have with the neural networks of the brain in observing the world requires us to choose amongst the different areas that are there. And some in your classroom, 25 students, are going to be focused on socially what's happening with other students around, and they're not interested in the chalkboard writing about maths on the blackboard or the whiteboard writing about maths. They're interested in what else is going on. And so we've got to realize that different people's brains are made up in different ways, so that they're tuning into different things that are going on. Some are tuning into different sounds. Some are tuning into different clues or different social clues or visual clues. And so we've got to develop an awareness that different things happening in the classroom are speaking to the students in different ways. When we use language, we've got to realize that the words that we use can mean very different things to the students. So we might say well done to a student, and those students who've done well before will think they mean well done. But those students who've been put down at home and put down in school, well done doesn't mean well done, does it? just means that the teacher is saying some words, but they don't have meaning. And so language can mean different things because students can be hearing language in different ways. When it comes to critical thinking, it's important to realise that what is written down and communicated can mean different things to different students in the classroom. So, and these sort of discussions aren't new. Back in ancient times, Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato were talking about the different meanings that are given to different areas of thinking. One way of thinking is empirical knowledge, which most people like in that you measure it, but not everyone is happy to focus on empirical knowledge like science and maths. Others want to be open to the mysteries of the universe, and this is why people are interested in dragons and witches and Harry Potter, because it's open to diverse ways of thinking. This idea of separating maths and science from humanities and English is probably more our recent times, and some people have said it has to do with industrialization, the way in which we just want people to fit into a particular part of society and not be open to the diversity that there is out there in the whole of society. So observation, one of the first ways that we learn and know, but realise that different students are hearing and seeing different things in the classroom because their brain and neurochemistry, neurodiverse, they're tuned into different things. Then we need to begin to reason beyond the observation, and different students may reason differently. Rationalise. Some students can rationalise in very logical ways. Other students, it's not going to make sense. We need to recognise the social context of reasoning. So the students around you are going to cause your reasoning to be very different at times. I applied for a job as a chaplain and I got the job. But one of the questions they asked me was, your class reads Genesis chapter 1, the world's made in 7 days. What do you think? What do you tell people there? And I had a look at the people who were interviewing me, and I knew a couple of them were quite fundamentalist people interviewing me who believed the world was made in 7 days, and I wouldn't get the job if I said that it wasn't. And then I noticed a couple of people were very scientific people who thought it was made in 13.7 billion years. So I wouldn't get the job if I offended them. So what I said was, it's important that we respect the diversity of viewpoints and give people to respect the diversity of viewpoints. And I got the job. And so, but we need to recognise the social context of our reasoning, don't we? And so if you're in one particular social group, you'll be pressured to think one way. And if you're in another group, you'll be pressured to think another way. And critical thinking tries to be open to the diversity of ways of thinking and humbly recognise the diversity that's out there. Literature review, we've mentioned, that's where you think about what people have written beforehand. And so in Essay 2 and Essay 3, we'd like you to do a little literature review where you look at all the knowledge over the last few hundred years that's ever been found on the topic that you were looking at, and you summarise it in a few hundred words. So small task, but literature review is that task, isn't it? And I guess you don't have a chance to look at all knowledge. So what you need to do is to find some really good scholarly articles in the last 5 or 8 years or so that have also done the literature review and summarised it. So you interact with them and say, this scholar said, that scholar said. The other thing with the literature review is that if you get all knowledge from one group of people thinking the same, then that really won't do. What you need is a diversity of views. And I've just quoted Genesis chapter 1, God making the world. Some people will say it's 7 24-hour days. So if I mention that, and then some people will say it's 13.7 billion years. And you can see there I've looked at 2 different viewpoints, a bit like a tripod. When you have the legs a long way apart, it's stable. And the same in critical thinking. When you have 3 points close together, then it's less stable. But if you have the 3 points a lot further apart, then it is more stable. And so I think a good essay will show that these are different viewpoints that are held. And so one approach is to try and have a diversity of viewpoints. The other is to have strong academic viewpoints. So you want the strongest scholars in the world on that particular topic. So you want strong academics, and then you want strong evidence-based. The other thing that we would say in choosing academic material is that you want academic material that is peer reviewed. And so in scholarly books and scholarly journal articles, they have usually been reviewed by other scholars. And you can see also evidence of scholarly material when they have lots of strong scholarly references at the end. And so when they have lots of strong scholarly references, then you know that it's a scholarly resource. Now, one of the problems with Wikipedia is that often you can't see the author, often you can't see a list of strong scholarly references, and also it's not been peer reviewed. And so that's why you normally wouldn't quote Wikipedia in a scholarly resource. And that would be different to the Stanford Encyclopedia. So if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and if you were to look up critical thinking, then they would have in these articles some way of identifying who's written the material. So Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has the author and citation information here. So David Hitchcock has written the article on critical thinking, and we can also find out some more information about David Hitchcock there on thinking. And so by going a bit further, I could find out a bit more about David Hitchcock as a philosopher. And so here we do a little bit of research. Notice how many few seconds it takes to find out some of this information if you just do a bit of an explore. So David Hitchcock, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, was at Master University, and these are some of the scholarly articles that he's written on logic and thinking, and these are other articles that he's written on thinking and education as well. So we would say that that is an acceptable scholarly article, this article on critical thinking in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And also notice at the end of the article, it's a lovely example of a well-written article. Notice how he looks at examples of thinking, definitions of thinking, ideas about critical thinking through history, major controversies where there's been differences, and then there are resources at the end. So it's a well-written article. Notice the paragraphs are well developed, and you've got good references through the paragraphs as he interacts with scholars. So it's well outlined. And then at the end of the article, and you've got a lovely discussion of educational methods relating to critical thinking there. And look at the number of resources in the bibliography at the end here. So if you've got a similar list of resources at the end of your essay, then I am sure you would do amazingly well. I had a student once who showed up with a huge list like this, and I showed it to one of my other lecturers. He said that this is not real. He's copied this, this is cheating. And so we called him in and we said, have you copied this? Have you been cheating? And he pulled out his notebooks and they'd handwritten all of these materials. He'd gone to the university, and in order to do very well, he'd written this huge amount of resources. I said, well, we had a choice, you know, if you'd just copied it word for word, we'd fail you, but unfortunately you've done all this research, so we'll have to give you a high distinction. So yeah, that's the way it unfolded. So look at the number of resources there. You know, the work that has gone into this article is huge. So that's a scholarly article, an example to aim for and live up to. And there are rewards. If you could put in this level of scholarly work. I met a girl from New Zealand who doing quite well scholarly, and then she decided she'd apply a couple of years ago to Harvard University in the US. So she applied, and surprise, surprise, they accepted her. And then they sent her back a notice saying, we've accepted you into Harvard. It only costs $100,000 a year to study. And she wrote back and said, you know, sad, I don't have $100,000 a year. They said, well, tell us a bit more about your background. And she, you know, 7 brothers and sisters, mum didn't work, battling away in New Zealand. And so she sent that off to Harvard, and they sent back, oh yeah, battling away. We'll pay you the $100,000 a year, and we'll pay you another $30,000 or $40,000 a year, just to, you know, living expenses and such forth. And she's studying at Harvard at the moment, fully paid for, fully looked after. So she did well in her studies, and if you do well in your studies, there are opportunities that are out there. People have been donating to Harvard over the last 300 years. Started as a Christian organisation, and they have about $20 billion sitting in the bank to help students out occasionally if students need some help. So if you do really, really well, there are opportunities in studying and writing and scholarly work. And yeah, occasionally people manage to do well. And it's the same with any field, isn't it? It's like sport and other areas. If you do well, there are people who will help you a bit along the way. So it's good to find out if you've got skills and abilities in these areas. So like a tripod, we want diversity of viewpoints. We want strong academic views. We want them peer reviewed. And then the literature review is where we gather these materials and we summarize them. And then in terms of language and thinking, you've got to think about what sort of language will you use, and you want language that's understandable, easy to work with. So you don't want to be using too many big words that you don't know the meaning of, but at the same time, you don't want it oversimplified, and you want well-developed paragraphs. Critical reflection is where you reflect on the sources that you use. If we look more carefully at the thinking that we have there, then that would be helpful. Now, one of the challenges in thinking is biases. We all have biases. So can I get you to write down now, what are some of the biases that shape your thinking? So your thinking may be limited by the biases you have, and they could shape your thinking. One of my biases is science. So I used to teach science. So I think science is wonderful. It's everything. And then another one of my biases is that my parents were Christians, and I went to a Christian church. And so, and I still go each week and worship and pray. And so that's another one of my biases. Now, actually, they clash a bit at times, because some of the people who've taught me science have said that you need to measure everything and weigh everything, and it's not really real if you can't measure it and weigh it. We did a science experiment once where we looked at some animals, and I wanted to get a bit poetic, you know, and describe these animals that we're looking at using poetic language. I got about 3 out of 10 for that. They said, you know, this is not an English class. This is not poetry. You know, we're giving you a very savage mark to remind you that science is not about poetry. And I think that's pretty sad, isn't it? And I guess there are times, you know, when you go to the doctor and you're ill, you don't necessarily want poetry, but at the same time, doctors should they be allowed to do some poetry? So what are the biases that shape you? Science is one bias, but my Christian faith, I guess, shapes another bias, and it's probably the other biases that I look to God to guide me in life. I was going to use the illustration to find me car parking spaces. You know, you pray, God, find me a car parking space. But then I thought I might offend half the class with this because some of your students might disagree with that. Marissa, what do you think of Christians who pray for car parking spaces? Any thoughts?
You're allowed to pray for anything, aren't you? As long as like it's for the good of mankind or you getting a parking space.
Yeah, that sounds good.
No one is harmed in the making of this prayer for a parking space.
That's true. But I can admit that, as a Christian, some people would say, my parents at times would say that, there's some things you'd pray for. But my daughter once, the television stopped working and we'd been talking to her about Christian things. And she said, Dad, Mum, one thing we need to do is to pray for it. And so she went up and prayed for it. And horror of horrors, it started working again. And I think it continued working. So, I mean, how do you explain that and work with that, etc.? So as a Christian, we do face certain biases. But Marissa, what are some of the biases that perhaps influence you and the way you think and write?
Without sort of divulging too much, I think you guys, but I think even just to go back a little bit, Dr. Hay, when you were speaking about observations, even when we think we're taking a non-biased observation, actually how we view the world is sort of tainted by our own life experience. And you'll often see this in kids with like a trauma background and things like that. We sit in a classroom and we think it looks really safe and welcoming, but to somebody else, because of their life experience, it actually could be quite threatening. So yeah, so like, I think because of my sort of life experience up to now, it's almost, I'm so open to everything, as in, and I often sort of say this to people, like, I'm not settled on anything. Like everything I think is true right now in this moment could change in the next moment, once I learn something else maybe that then grows my knowledge on a topic or completely can change everything. Like when I was speaking with my pastor, I only sort of started formal Bible study in the last 12 months. And when I first met my pastor, I said to him that I've always sort of believed in something other than just what you see around us, but I never sort of hung it on any one thing. And I think it's only because I got to a point where I was like, what is true? What is true for me? What is true for me is not true for somebody else. And what is true for them may not be true for me. So, I think it's if anything, it's helped me be not so biased and completely open to the diversity that is life, I guess.
Yeah. And this is what we're going to look at in assignments 2 and 3. So assignment 2, we want you to look at what is your way of viewing the world. So assignment 2, we want you to know yourself. That is, what is your way of viewing the world? And for me, it's a Western, white, modernist view, loving science, maths, that sort of thing, with a lot of love of humanities thrown in with art and music and those areas, Leonardo da Vinci and all of that thrown in as well. So that's part of my background. And then as a Christian, the sort of Anglican Catholic background combined with some Pentecostal jump around a bit background. And so there's some of my biases and views of the world. But you mentioned trauma and background. I remember one student went along to a church and I saw the Anglican church that I was going to, which was made out of sandstone, as a beautiful, welcoming place. And this student had never been into a sandstone church before. He'd only ever seen horror movies, Dracula and that sort of thing. And he wouldn't go in. He said it was the scariest place in the world. And I remember when I went to the University of Sydney, have anyone gone into some parts in the University of Sydney that are made of sandstone and they got dark wood and that sort of thing? And they're scary places. I mean, who would go into a scary place like University of Sydney? And yet other people would see that as incredibly welcoming, wouldn't they? And so we have to remember this in whichever classroom and class that you teach. There'll be people who've had success at school who see it as welcoming, and people who've been through institutions and families that see these things as the scariest places in the world. And when it comes to the teaching of maths, you know, I tend to think mathematics is wonderful. You can do incredible things with mathematics. Hands up anyone here who has maths phobia. So there'll be some students who have maths phobia, who are, you know, maths is, you know, it's put the 20% in the world who are bright at maths develop these complex equations to torture the 80% who don't have that ability. And so we have to realise, you know, the government tells us we've got to spend, you know, so much of our time teaching mathematics, and 80% of our class have got maths phobia. How do you work with that? I mean, the secret is to have a cake cut in half and tell them that's a half and then a quarter, and then they all eat the cake at the end, and have M&Ms, and then you know, divide the M&Ms into groups and all that sort of thing. That's the one way to overcome it. But and then you talk about what is true, you know, all these different views. So that's going to be assignment 2, is know yourself. And then assignment 3 is going to be looking at 2 Indigenous groups, of which one must be an Australian Aboriginal group. And so we're looking at cultural difference and the way in which people in your class, students are going to see the world differently because they come from different cultural backgrounds. And we can all learn from one another. And if you've got 25 students in a class, you might have 25 cultures represented, and family cultures and subcultures, and they can all learn from one another. Now, bias is not always bad, but it's often unavoidable, and we have to admit what our biases are. It's important that we recognise our biases. And sometimes in an essay, it's worth having a few sentences that say, I came from a Christian Anglican background, and I see the world from the perspective that there is a divine being who's made this world. And I acknowledge there are others who may see the world differently. That happens by chance, is the way some people see the world. So we've got to acknowledge our biases, acknowledge other viewpoints, and we've got to work with the difference. And then we've got to ground that again. We don't want to just become agnostic and give up. So we've got to reflect on assumptions and biases and inferences. And what do we think is true? Why do we think certain things are true? Now, all of us use our memory when we think. And some of us have had good thoughts, and our memory will kick in and say, hey, this is great to do maths. You've had wonderful experiences. And others, our memory will kick in and say, this is dreadful experience. You've had not so good experiences. So it's worth understanding a bit of neuroscience. It's worth understanding a little bit of how the brain works. Do people believe in left brain, right brain? Now, there's a real danger in left brain, right brain. There's a danger in all sorts of labeling. And left brain, right brain is one of those labelings. Anyone got any thoughts? Nonil, do you have any thoughts on left brain, right brain? And then I might ask Bridget whether she has any thoughts on left brain, right brain. But Nonil, do you have any knowledge or thoughts on left brain and right brain?
Yeah, I'm working with trauma and children. I think understanding the brain in the left and right brain is important. Working as what parts of our brains do shut down with different emotions and feelings and memories.
Yeah, so important. So you've got these different parts of your brain, and it's possibly that parts of your left brain are very sequential, and parts of the right brain are more creative, imaginative, intuitive. And then if you recognise, some students may have found that focusing more on the linear sequential has given them success in life, and then other students have found focusing on the more creative has given them success in life. And the reality is God has given us both. and it's important that we recognise the capacity to switch from one to the other and value of both. Bridget, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this is really key. I work with a disability little man, and I tend to use this language with him and say to him, are you working from your left brain or your right brain? And or are you working from both? And I always look at it as, you know, God has given us our brain, and it molds together to work with both. And I think it's very key to actually bring both of them into play as well, because, you know, when you're doing arts, you are very creative, but when you're doing, I don't know, like English, it can be very dull. But I think if you bring it in together, it's more creative, and it's more, I guess, kind of upbeat for them as well. And my little man that has a disability, he always responds back to me. He's like, oh, I'm being creative, or I'm doing this, or like, I can do this. So it's actually really key, left and right brain, that works, function all together.
And I like that idea of encouraging students to recognise the value of each of the different sides of the brain, and then encouraging the students to recognise the way in which they can switch from one to the other, and that can be helpful. So you can use maths and science in art and music, and you can use art and music in maths and science when students are finding that a little bit to left brain oriented. So there are ways in which you can cater for the diversity that's in the classroom. But one of the major things that we'd encourage is don't label the students as these students are left brain or right brain. So we should be very wary of labeling students. That can be very dangerous. Any thoughts or questions further on left brain, right brain, or the dangers of labeling students? Put your hand up if you've got any further thoughts to make there. What are you thinking? The other thing to keep in mind is emotions and reasoning. So some students won't see the emotional and intuition as being so important, but all of us have got emotion and intuition going on in our subconscious that sometimes we don't tap into. And so sometimes we favour certain ways of thinking because of emotions, and certainly there is value in recognising the role that emotions play. There's value in recognising the role that imagination plays in thinking as well. Also, we need to recognise that scholarly thinking is not just about thinking, it's about application. And sometimes more important than approaches to thinking is, what do you do with the thinking? And so we can look at left brain, right brain, but what do we do with this? How do we apply it? And so the application side can be very, very important. So there are some thoughts and some ideas that I encourage you to look at. So the contemporary challenge for us is to handle large amounts of information. Every topic you look at, there's going to be a huge avalanche of information that's out there, like Christianity, maths, science. There's a lot of information that's out there. We need skills to access and sort through it. There is value in Christian approaches to thinking as well. One of the dangers of critical thinking is that we can leave out spirituality and prayer. And one of the things that many Christian thinkers have wanted to encourage is to recognise that Christians should be leaders in thinking, because it's part of our DNA, part of what's in the Bible. As the Apostle Paul was writing about, is good, clear thinking that is not proud, but still thinks well. And so Os Guinness and others have written about the rich history of the contribution that Christians have made to thinking. And the Christian mind, how could a Christian think? Lemires writes about the value of this, but Mark Noll says that sometimes Christians can be known for the scandal of not thinking. And in his book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, Mark Noll says we shouldn't accept that we are to not think. If God created all things, then he created the capacity to think, and there's a strong link between that. And in the weeks to come, we'll be exploring the value of thinking for Christians and for Christianity. And so encourage you to recognize the value of thinking and also the value of careful thinking. So what is critical thinking? The word critical can for some mean negative, but really it means more accurate thinking. And at times you do need one person to play devil's advocate and to say this is another way of looking at things. You can have a thesis, antithesis and synthesis is one way of looking at it. Someone says this is the way we should do it. Sometimes you need someone to put forward the antithesis, the opposite view, and then we can work on a synthesis where we bring the different views together. So critical means considering the minute details, the different viewpoints. It can also mean considering all aspects of thinking about a given topic. But at some stage, you've also got to narrow that down. So artistic, creative, poetic, you can't think of all of those things if you're making a diagnosis of a car or a sick person. You've got to focus on just a few things you're looking at. So often critical thinking is focused thinking. John Dewey was one of the first to use the term critical thinking in modern times, and he uses it to describe reflective thinking. So it doesn't just jump into an answer, it reflects on what's the evidence, what are the ways of thinking. And this is an educational goal. This is how education considers a diversity of viewpoints. And it's also a scientific goal. It seeks to weigh up what we are looking at. Many people today talk about evidence-based understanding. So evidence-based understanding is where we look at the evidence that is involved. And this has made huge progress in science. I know someone who got ill with leukemia, and with before 1985, they would possibly have died from that. But after 1985, using evidence-based understanding, they discovered that there were a certain vitamin A was one, and there were also other ways of using various treatments, and now they got 90-something% success rate. So it was based on evidence-based understanding of the different processes that are taking place, not just guessing, but looking at the different ways we can understand. So having had a look at some of these different ways of thinking and thinking well, can I get you to write down now from session 1 and 2, what are things that have stood out to you from these couple of classes that we've looked at already? So time of reflection, what stood out to you so far about our thinking, about critical thinking? What have you liked? What's been useful in thinking about critical thinking that you've found helpful so far? Let's write down 2 or 3 things that have been useful for you. And I forgot to mention before, if you want to make a note of that article on critical thinking from the Stanford Encyclopedia, you might want to make note of the article there, and you could look that up. It's quite a good scholarly article on critical thinking. Edward Glasser was one of the major thinkers back in the 1940s to write about critical thinking in education. And he said it's so important in teaching students to get them to think reflectively. And he said 3 things about critical thinking. He said, firstly, we want to be thoughtful about questions and problems and subjects. And then secondly, we want to be logical so we can lay it out systematically. And then thirdly, we want to be able to skillfully apply certain approaches. And we've talked a bit about those approaches, like a literature review, considering a variety of viewpoints, recognizing diversity of viewpoints. Rachel, what are some things that have stood out to you today?
I think my big one is everyone's different views. Obviously, having done this class before, I've had my peers and my people in my hub, and very similar kind of viewpoints, obviously, because we work under the same school and the same organization hub, that we kind of found that we all had very similar views, even though we had differences, obviously, but like in this group, that there's differences that I didn't think about last semester, and there's things that I don't think you really think of until you're outside of, you know, a kind of comfort zone. And we're kind of in that comfort zone with my group, that it's nice to see everybody else's views, and like the left brain, right brain thinking, because they're similar but different points. Like I was saying before, they're similar and different viewpoints that I have of that kind of thinking with the left brain and right brain, and kind of my own biases. And, you know, I've got something called aphantasia, which means essentially I don't visually see images in my head, and I don't have an internal monologue. So I think about left versus right brain very differently because of that. So my brain doesn't kind of quite as function as, you know, someone that can visualize something in their head and have an internal monologue. And so in that sense, that with the brain hemispheres, that it's just slightly different with my thinking, because, you know, there's other things in that way of, you know, how my brain works.
Yeah, which goes back to the no neurotypical. We've all got different ways of thinking, and if you've got a class of 25 students, they're all thinking differently. Karen Stacey, what are some of the things that have stood out to you?
Okay, very much similar to our last answers, reflective learning and acknowledgement of biases, especially with your writing of essays. Make learning relevant. So relevant to current day, to engage students, understanding that each student will have a different way of learning, and tap into that way of learning so that they can feel good about themselves and get the most out of each lesson. And do not label a student is most important, especially with left and right brain.
Yeah, so good. That's so important, isn't it? Tiffany, what are some things that stood out to you?
Okay, so the things that stood out to me was understanding that you do have a biases and acknowledging it. You know, not thinking you don't think a certain way because of your background. Like, we all think differently, and that's okay, but we have to accept it and acknowledge it. The tripod method was very interesting to me. Just making sure you know what you're reading, making sure you're reading the correct things, asking the right questions for what the answers that you want, and staying open-minded, but being grounded at the same time. So coming back to what you believe in, but also asking those extra questions that may change your views, but then also, you know, reminding yourself what you do believe in, and that others may have different views.
And also talk to people and talk to the books. And the books are so valuable. I mean, I can't talk to Martin Luther anymore. That was 500 years ago. But I can read Martin Luther's writings. I can't talk to John Wesley 300 years ago. I can read John Wesley's writings. I can't talk to Thomas Aquinas, but I can read Thomas Aquinas' writings. And you can go online, and if you were to put in Thomas Aquinas writings, he was one of the great teachers at Paris, and you can still get free online PDF or whatever readings of Thomas' writings. So here's Summa Theologica at Project Gutenberg. You can still read the book, you can download a copy of it, browse your way through it. So this is a 1,000-year-old book, and yet it's been made available to you. You can read about what Thomas Aquinas wrote about the existence of God, the goodness of God, the will of God. So you can dialogue through books with these sorts of resources. Question 1, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine to place our purpose within proper limits. So this is what you would have learned at the University of Paris if you'd gone there and Thomas Aquinas was teaching. And the same thing with Aristotle. If you were to go to back even longer in time, so if you were to go to Greece back in say 300 BC, then Aristotle would have been teaching there, and you could sign up at his gymnasium. I guess being a gymnasium that they would have had the combination of physical exercise together with the mind. And these are the books that Aristotle wrote. And so here's his book on metaphysics that you could still read it today and still read what Aristotle wrote on. So if you went there, he would say, all men, this is the lecture given by Aristotle, all men by nature desire to know. Any indication of this is the delight we take in our senses, for even apart from their usefulness, their love for themselves, the sense of sight, not only with a view to action, but to get to know things by nature. Animals are also born with the faculty of sensation, but we as humans have this capacity to reflect further. So we have this capacity of dialogue, and you can also dialogue with your lecturers. I encourage you, as you study, chat to your lecturers, talk to your lecturers, and if you get a chance to go even further, you never know. There can be opportunities to go further with those talks. I went to a conference in overseas once. I was walking down the street in Amsterdam, and there's an old guy walking down the street, so I thought I'll walk with him. And I said, hi, my name's Sam, just going to this conference on Old Testament. He said, oh, I'm going to a conference on Old Testament as well. My name's Joseph Blenkinstop, he said to me. And I thought, he's one of the leading Old Testament scholars in the world. And so there are opportunities, aren't there, to chat to different people. And so take the opportunity to talk to one another as students, to talk to other people. So dialogue with the books, dialogue with other people, and dialogue with yourself as well. Get to know, what are your biases, what are your background, why do you value certain ways of thinking? Because in many ways, critical thinking is dialogue, isn't it? And it's important to choose the right dialogue partners, and also to have an understanding of yourself and your biases and background, so that you can dialogue with yourself as well as dialoguing with others. So let's take our break there for about 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll come back at about 10 past, quarter past, and we'll have a look further at the subject of critical thinking for effective learning. And this will be the last hour for today, Monday, and then we'll meet at 9 a.m. on Friday for 3 hours. If you have any particular questions about this sessions that we're looking at, then certainly ask me in that session, and particularly in the last 10 minutes or so of the next session, there'll be a chance to ask if you have any questions. And then I've not spent a lot of time talking about assignments and that so far. There are videos on that as well. There's notes on that, but if you want more information on the assignments, then I can give you that. There would be other questions that some people might have as well. I guess my main emphasis has been on putting in the 10 hours a week, reading the material on Moodle, watching some of the videos and engaging with the material, and then making a start on the 3 assignments, the first of which is 10 forum posts, 1 each week for 10 weeks. The next one is the assignment on knowing yourself and your background, and there's description of that on the page. And then the third one is knowing 2 other Indigenous cultures and their background, and then relating it to teaching. So I'll see you in 10 minutes time. See you shortly.